Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, most merciful. Alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we continue our discussion on the psychology of Surah Hamd, Surah Fatiha, the first chapter of the Holy Quran. A chapter that we recite at least 10 times a day, just from the 5 obligatory prayers. And in this, our 9th discussion on the subject, we return once again to the core question of how can we get more benefit, more value from what we are already doing. We already know and recite this surah. Alhamdulillah, this is great. We teach it to our young children and we recite it throughout our lives. But the question that arises is, does our recitation of the chapter change over time? Are we drinking more from this unending fountain? Or have we taken one sip of one cup and satiated ourselves with it? Because the invitation to recite the surah consistently through the day, from the beginning at Fajr Salah, early in the morning, right the way through to the end in the evening at Isha Salah, the invitation is to keep revisiting this fountain and to keep drinking from this source of Surah Fatiha. And in our preceding discussions, we've looked at different aspects of the practical psychology of the 7 verses that constitute this short surah, from Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim all the way through to the final part of the final verse that we discussed today. We began with the first part of verse 7 in our previous discussion, seeking the path of those who have been blessed, Surat al-Ladina anamta alayhim. Not the path of those who have incurred the wrath of Allah, nor of those who have gone astray. So we're asking, Surat al-Ladina anamta alayhim, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِينَ. Allowing us the opportunity to remind ourselves of what is the path of those who have been blessed, what is the set of actions that have historically resulted in people not receiving the grace of Allah, and those who have been astray, so that we may raise a mirror to ourselves to check, are we on the right path or not? And not just each day, but throughout the day. Just as a person who is driving wants to check that he or she is driving within his or her lane. You don't want to be veering all over the place on the motorway. You might get an accident. And similarly with our spiritual journey, in order to make sure we move purposefully, progressively, systematically, and efficiently. The efficiency is important. We seek the straight path. Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. Guide us to the straight path. The path of those who have been blessed, those who have been spiritually successful. Surat al-Ladina anamta alayhim. غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ. Not the path of those who have encountered spiritual accidents and have incurred the wrath of Allah, so that they've been deprived of His grace. Now, when we look more closely at what this may mean, we have a contrast here. We discussed in our previous analysis how the path of those who have been blessed has been narrated in a number of verses. We looked at verses from Surah Nisa, from Surah Insan, including specifically from Surah Azab, Surah 33, verse 33, which clarified, إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمُ الرِّجْسَ أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ وَيُطَهِّرَكُمْ تَطْهِيرًا. اللهم صل على محمد. That surely, surely, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيُذْهِبَ عَنْكُمُ الرِّجْسَ أَهْلَ الْبَيْتِ. That Allah intended to purify the Ahlul Bayt, the household of the Holy Prophet, from whom we have the Aimma alayhimus salam, the Imams who we follow, and to give them the most thorough purification, so that if we are ever in any doubt, whose path is verse 7 of Surah Fatiha referring to, Sirat al-Ladina anamta alayhim, to be absolutely clear, the Quran removes any form of ambiguity about this by offering us verse 33 from Surah 33. And there are many others that talk about the Abrar, for example, from Surah Insan, and then going on to clarify who they are. And we see in commentaries, both Shia and Sufi and Sunni commentaries, for instance, from Zamakhshari, about how the episode of charitable giving of the Abrar, those who are blessed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in that surah refers to Bi Fatima alayhi salam, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and Hassanain alayhi salam, the family of the Holy Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt. And we get that from Sunni sources as well as from Shia sources. Now that's important because one of the great beauties of Surah Fatiha, particularly in our current troubled times, is that this is a chapter that we all recite. This is a chapter that can serve as a strong stepping stone when we want to cross the river of life. And the river has become a lot more tempestuous now. So finding strong, reliable stepping stones becomes all the more important. And Surah Fatiha, Surah Al-Hamd is one such stepping stone. It is not by coincidence that we're required to recite it 10 times a day. It may take just a few seconds to recite these 7 short verses. But the depth of meaning and the rejuvenative, transformative power that they have can transform our day and the rest of the days to come. As we discussed with the early verses in our preceding discussions, in this, our penultimate discussion, with this final verse, we see a very clear warning that it's not just about looking at the positive, but we also need to be wary of what can happen when things go wrong. This is also a surah about risk management. But how can you manage risks that you don't know about? And so out of Allah's rahmah that He established and then reiterated at the beginning of the surah with Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. All praise to Allah, the Lord of the worlds. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Reiterating once again His incredible compassion. So that would not be complete without a warning of risks. And this is why we have verse 7 of not just Surat al-Ladina anamta alayhim, the path of those who have been good, but also غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ alayhim, not those who have fallen into the risks of shaitan, or وَلَضَّالِينَ, who have gone completely astray. Now risk management is important, but it requires risk analysis first. There is a difference between risk analysis and risk management. If we want to manage something properly, we need to analyze it first. And when we look at the commentaries of the Holy Quran, they have analyzed the second part of this 7th verse of the first chapter in great depth. If we look at sources accepted by all Muslims, Qurtubi's commentary, for example, he says things that we can all agree on. That this idea of those upon whom Allah's wrath is, and we can think about wrath as being the absence of His infinite grace and compassion. So they are regarded as those who are the idolaters, of those who deny the Tawheed, the oneness, the all-encompassing unity of all of creation, and therefore the connection between all beings, that we are all connected through the essence of all life, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the specific warning about those who go astray, وَلَضَّالِينَ, as being the hypocrites, so that we need to be careful about being faithful to act upon that which we say we believe in, both that which we say to ourselves and say to others. We can be hypocrites to ourselves just as we can be hypocrites to others. And those are risks that we need to analyze through the process of self-analysis that the preceding 6 verses of Surah Fatiha strongly encouraged and provided the means by which to do so. So on the foundation of all that analysis, risk analysis, we can then do effective risk management of not falling into the traps of hypocrisy and idolatry. And this is why we also need to clarify that one of the risks that exist is for tahmat, for wrong accusation, of wrongly accusing others of idolatry when they are not the followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, the Abrar in the Holy Quran, the Sirat al-Ladina anamta alayhim, the path of those who have been blessed. The people who seek to emulate the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt al-Salam are often accused, and not just accused lightly, but accused in murderous ways, of idolatry, because we seek the intercession, the shafa, of the Abrar, of the Ahlul Bayt al-Salam. Yet, this is not idolatry, far from it. This is a manifestation of Tawheed, because the gift of intercession is part of the rahmah of Allah. We keep reiterating Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. We say it 10 times a day. But His rahmah is so broad that it encompasses those who we have been sent through His grace to open the door to His grace, to hold our hands as we walk over the threshold into His grace. And the Holy Quran, in the very next chapter, in Surah Baqarah, in verse 255, makes this clear. مَنْ ذَا الَّذِي يَشْفَهُ إِنْدَهُ إِلَّا بِإِذْنِهِ. Who is there who can intercede with Him other than through His permission? So, just as it's important not to fall into idolatry, because then we become part of غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ, or indeed وَلَا الضَّالِينَ, equally it is also important not to wrongly accuse others of idolatry when they are actually following Quranic practice and they are engaging in the widest manifestation of Tawheed, understanding that the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala extends not just to His book, but also to those who guide us to its mysteries. As the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, has guided us in his famous hadith accepted by all Muslims, that he said, the hadith of Thaqalain, that he leaves two weighty things: the Quran, Kitabullah, wa itrati, the holy book, and my family, to guide you as to what this book contains. So when we think about Surat al-Ladina anamta alayhim, the path of those who are righteous, and the subsequent path, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ, not the path of the idolaters, we need to be careful about who the idolaters are and who they are not. Because the psychology of this is critical. When we look at, for example, the psychology of shafa, when we analyze the grammar and the etymology, the roots of the word of shafa, we see that the roots are, yes, intercession, but also, and this comes from general dictionaries, for instance, like Hans Wehr, generally accepted dictionaries of Arabic from Orientalists. It's got, the word shafa has got aspects of companionship, of giving support to that which was previously alone. Intercession helps us through the dark moments of depression, through the uncertainties of anxiety, to keep us steadfast on the Sirat al-Mustaqim. And it is those who have been graced by that path, Sirat al-Lazina anamta alayhim, who know it intimately well to be able to guide us along that path. This is why we seek their shafa as part of the manifestation of the grace, of the rahmah of Tawheed, of La ilaha illallah. This is where, when we think about the غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِينَ, the path of those who have gone astray, we see all too clearly today people who write, who daub with white paint on black flags, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah, yet engage in the shirk of worshipping their ego of violence, of extinguishing the message of compassion, of mercy, of grace in Surah Fatiha, that they claim to recite 10 times a day like other Muslims, but ignore the grace and the compassion within it. And therein lies a clear example of what the Quran could mean by غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ, not the path of those who have gone astray, not the path of those who commit acts that are totally contrary to what Surah Al-Hamd guides us as to what Islam is all about. The compassion, the forgiveness, the grace that is inherent within this chapter. And because of its importance, we're encouraged to recite it throughout the day, throughout our lives. Yet, so great is the tragedy if those core messages of compassion are ignored. And when we look at current psychology, we are seeing more and more evidence of the importance of compassion. We looked at in our previous discussion of compassion in the form of service and altruism, but also in terms of renewal and rejuvenation. We need compassion for ourselves to be able to break the maintenance cycle of rumination, of ruminating on the negative events of the past, worries about the future, that may lock in place mental health difficulties such as anxiety and indeed depression. This idea of Surat al-Ladina anamta alayhim can encourage us to seek the correct path afresh. And if we have strayed, then we may revisit the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the rahmah that He promises at the beginning, so that we may come back to the Sirat al-Mustaqim, to the straight path. This final part of the final verse, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا is a reminder for us to free ourselves from that which we may have done to take us off the path during the course of the day, so that we may end our day back on the right path. And this is why we're also encouraged to recite this Surah Fatiha as one of the last things we do before we go to sleep. To recite Surah Fatiha, to recite 3 times Surah Qul Huwallah, to recite Salawat. Because these are ways in which we can ground ourselves to round off the day. And this is important because one of the problems that we're seeing in terms of factors that embed anxiety, and in some cases also depression, is a lack of good sleep and worries whilst we're sleeping, so that we get very shallow sleep and we wake up exhausted. Reciting Surah Fatiha and becoming grounded in the compassion, in the mindfulness of the grace of Allah in the present moment, can allow us to experience a quality of sleep that may be much deeper, much more restful than we may otherwise have the benefit of tasting and experiencing. When we go further into the analysis of this 7th verse, we are reminded of a couple of verses that we do need to think about with a little bit more clarity. Surah 16, verse 106, says about those who have gone astray, that those are the people who have allowed themselves to open their hearts to disbelief. And when we think about the different forms of disbelief, of kufr, one of them, if we look at the definition of a kafir, of a non-believer, it's somebody who covers up the truth. And one of the aspects of kufr is to cover up the grace that we have received. We looked in our previous discussions about the psychological importance of cultivating an attitude of gratitude. We looked at that when we were thinking about the verse, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, and the mental health benefits of it. We're also warned that the path of those who have gone astray, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ, an element of going astray is engaging in kufr and covering up the bounties that we have received, including the grace of faith itself. And one of the problems when we look at the commentaries, some of the commentaries talk about the psychology of this verse quite explicitly. And they talk about the psychology of being astray. And in seeking to elucidate this, they point out that another verse of the Quran unpacks the wisdom inherent in verse 7 of Surah Fatiha. One of which is verse 50 from Surah 28, Surah Qasas, which asks rhetorically that who is more astray than one who follows his desire, his ego, without guidance from Allah? And the Arabic here is worth focusing on. It says, وَمَنْ أَذَلُّ. So we've got a similar root. We've got غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ from Surah Al-Hamd. This verse has a similar root. It says, وَمَنْ أَذَلُّ. Who is more astray? مِمَّنِ اتَّبَعَ هَوَاءٌ. Other than those who follow their own desires, their own ego, their own hawa. بِغَيْرِ هُدًى مِنَ اللَّهِ. Without the grace of guidance from Allah. Hence, in Surah Fatiha, we ask, Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. guide us to the straight path, in the definite. As-sirat al-mustaqim. Ihdina, guide us collectively. And we see in the difficulties of what we face today in the world, the importance of the grammar of Surah Fatiha with the term ihdina in the plural, guide us, ihdina sirat, guide all of us collectively, because we see what happens when some people follow the path of those who are astray and engage in violence in the name of a religion founded upon peace. The peace and grace of which we reiterate 10 times a day, at least, if not more, just from the Surah Fatiha, reminding us of the importance of not falling into the trap of ego and remaining mindful of the cognitive processes within our mind. This 7th verse is a clear recommendation to think about thinking about the processes by which we think, becoming aware of those aspects within our psychology that facilitate us being on the straight path. Those aspects that actually take us away, such as service, that keep us on the straight path, as well as those aspects that take us astray, such as ego, arrogance, such as a lack of opening our hearts to others, anger, hatred, and the importance of opening our hearts to experience for ourselves as a personal experience, not just as a theological concept, but as a personal experience, the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the compassion. Because all too often we find ourselves living in a community that is increasingly judgmental about everyone around us. We start questioning how observant people are about their faith, and how this person is not a very good Muslim, and this person is such and such. And actually we apply that to ourselves, and we become particularly critical about ourselves. Now, when we do that, we start closing our hearts. The invitation from Surah Fatiha is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most compassionate, the most merciful. We need to begin by extending that compassion to ourselves, so that we may create a future that is free of the negativity that we may have experienced in our past. This is not about ignoring our weaknesses and the bad things we may have done. No, it's about taking responsibility, as we see from Surah Fatiha, Maliki Yawmiddin, the master of the day of judgment. So we need to be conscious that there is accountability. And there is a risk of going astray, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ. So that risk management is there, but we remain positive in our psychology, that whatever the past may have been, through the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as He reiterates He is Rahman and Rahim, we may create a new future, a positive future, with the motivation that we are not alone. We may drink once again from the fountain of Surah Fatiha to quench our thirst. Join me, therefore, in a prayer for those who have guided us to this fountain of grace, those who may have passed away, our parents, our teachers, our ancestors, who have taught us of this Surah Fatiha. Let us conclude with a recitation for their benefit. Surat al-Mubarakat al-Fatiha.